All right, so we are starting Biochemistry 2, which is going to expand from our Biochemistry 1. Biochemistry 1 talks about the differences between the two categories of organic molecules and inorganic molecules. In Biochemistry 2, we're specifically talking about organic molecules. And here is a list directly from your notes as a reminder from last week. Organic molecules are things like carbohydrates. The second one is lipids, also known nickname fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. So we're going to break this up into 4 different parts, breaking it down into its different organic molecules. The first one we're going to talk about is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are going to be building blocks of sugars. So the sugars are going to come together and they are going to make carbohydrates. The most common sugar is glucose, and that's used for instant energy. Our sugar is used for instant energy. And they're made up of these elements, which is from Biochemistry 1, carbon and hydrogen. Yes, we know that. That's why it's organic. And nutrition, examples for carbohydrates are things like pasta and bread and potatoes. If we take it a step further, how do we identify these sugars? The shape. If you look at this shape, I like to think of it like a ring or a diamond ring. Here's where you put your finger, and then there's the diamond on top. This is actually a glucose. You can also identify carbohydrates and sugars based on their names. Look at this. So we've got glucose and fructose and galactose and sucrose and lactose and maltose, and all of them have something in common. They all end with ose. So that's another way you can identify these different types of sugars. They end with O-S-E. Now, there are more types of sugars that become complex. And those complex sugars have different types of names. There is the ones that are stored in animals, and those are called glycogen. And the ones that are stored in plants are things like starch or cellulose. So those simple ones end with ose, and these more complex carbohydrates are things like glycogen, starch, and cellulose. And you have to know that all of these names fall under this category of carbohydrates. That carbohydrate falls under the larger category of organic molecules. So if we take a look, here's a bunch of glucoses, right? So we've got one, and then we've got another one, and then we've got another one. So it's 1 sugar, 2 sugars, and 3 sugars. Now, when you build them up, so that means that 1 sugar is added to another sugar, and then is added to another sugar, that process has a special name. That process is called synthesis. So, synthesis means to build up. So notice in this picture here with the structural formula, and then underneath the chemical formula, it takes the structure plus another structure, and it builds them together, or it puts them together. That's called synthesis, and it removes the water, which is why you see water at the end over here, and that's a byproduct. And that's when 1 glucose plus, or added on, plus another glucose combine together to make a larger molecule. For this case, it's maltose. And there it is once again, this 1 plus this one goes together. This one plus this one goes together to make something larger. That's known as the process of synthesis. Now, the reverse can also happen. So instead of it building up, instead of it adding on, it can destroy, it can break apart, it can deconstruct. And that process, that deconstructing, you could kind of see it. Let's see if you can identify it. This is bigger, and then it breaks apart into two smaller. When it breaks apart, it actually has the addition of H2O, which I believe is a hint for the name of this process. So that H2O kind of, when you think H2O, you should be thinking, that's water. So water is hydration. So this name of this breaking apart and this decomposing is actually called, tough name, it's hard to say, hydrolysis. Hydrolysis. So hydrolysis takes that water and it breaks apart the molecule. It breaks apart the carbohydrate. And when it breaks apart the carbohydrate, it goes into its simpler parts. And those simpler parts, for this example, are these simple sugars. So it takes the big molecule, it adds water, hydration, and then when it adds that water, it breaks apart into simpler sugars. That's hydrolysis. Those are opposite reactions. Synthesis is building, hydrolysis is breaking apart. They are opposite reactions. We can also say that those reactions relate to some life functions, things that make an organism living. So when it builds up, so the glucose adds on to become a carbohydrate, that reaction synthesis, the life function is growth or growing, right? Which kind of makes sense because you're adding on. It's building up. So building up would be that process of growth. Then the opposite reaction, hydrolysis, takes that carbohydrate, breaks it apart, decomposes it to its building blocks, glucose, I could also say sugar, and that life function is digestion. So that's our carbohydrates, our breakdown for carbohydrates, our breakdown for that organic molecule carbohydrates. Let's take a look at this final question. Is the following reaction an example of synthesis or hydrolysis? So I'm looking at these. We've got some big numbers, C12, H22, O11, plus, H2O. I know what H2O is. H2O is water. So when I add water, I should be thinking, hydration, hydrolysis. Let's just make sure it's breaking down into smaller parts, and it is. C12 is more, this is less, so it breaks into simpler. C6, H12, O6, plus another smaller one, C6, H12, O6. So this reaction is hydrolysis. That is what you need to know about carbohydrates.